أقامت كلية لندن للأعمال مؤتمرها السنوي 21 الذي يسلط الضوء على التقدم الاقتصادي بكافة مجالاته في الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا، وبحضور أهم وزراء وقادة أعمال المنطقة، حيث جاءت مشاركة المملكة في المؤتمر لنقل صورة الرؤية الاستراتيجية للتطور في ريادة المشاريع والتنوع الاقتصادي بما يجذب الاستثمار العالمي.
المملكة العربية السعودية لم تربط نفسها بدولة معينة، وإنما اتجهت شرقا، اتجهت لأوروبا، اتجهت لكثير من الأماكن، طالما أن هنالك فرص للتبادل والتعاون الاقتصادي المشتركة وتحقق فائدة للبلدين، فإن المملكة تقدم عليها. وهذا ما أقدمت عليه سواء من خلال صندوق الاستثمارات العامة أو من خلال مشاريع الفردية.
So I have in this guest panel د.محمد who's a former senior advisor to the Minister of Energy in Saudi Arabia. الصبان have led international negotiations on behalf of Saudi Arabia in the climate change, attended Kyoto in Japan, one of the early negotiations about climate change. We have on this panel as well Hussein Al-Mir, who's the Director of Global Offshore Winds and UK, which is part of Masdar. We have Dr. Bassam Fatouh, the Director of Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, one of the most influential think tanks when it comes to energy here in the UK, but also globally. And last but not least, Alex Schneider, the President of Energy Intelligence. Energy Intelligence is known for conducting the Energy Forum, the Energy Intelligence Forum happening here in London every year, one of the largest platforms of energy. So he's very well-rounded on the energy conversation and the energy transition. So I would ask you all to welcome the panelists to the stage. You can, yeah. I'm sorry. Perfect. Welcome.
Thank you.
I think we have a tough conversation ahead of us.
We'll see.
So when we're talking energy, we have the representation of the conventional energy wisdom. We have the representation from the renewables sector, Mr. Hussein. Let me start this question to Alex. Is diversifying away from oil a myth to the world? Is this a dreamy goal that the world is trying to achieve? Can you shed some light on the energy transition?
Good. Well, thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, London Business School. It's a pleasure to be here. We are partners of yours, and we really appreciate this event. Like you say, we do host a big event, and we're always impressed when people pull off great events. It's not easy to do, and we know it. So diversification, well, you started with the most difficult question. Can we diversify away from oil? And I guess the way that we frame this at Energy Intelligence, we're an energy information firm, so we run modeling. We don't take sides, so we don't, if oil stays forever or we move to renewables tomorrow, it's, our job is just to say how that path is going. So the way that we organize our thinking around this is laying out the transition scenarios. We've got 4 scenarios that we talk about here. And our base case right now is what we call the momentum scenario. And in the momentum scenario, as we see it right now, based on current policies, based on technology, based on a variety of other factors, is that we see the world transitioning, and that means that oil will peak somewhere in the 2030s, early 2030s, and that's an adjustment from where we used to see it. We saw it maybe happening a bit sooner a few years ago, so there's a slowing of the transition. We see gas peaking in the 2040s or beyond the 2040s, and we see the world heading for a 2.5 degree warming. So that's well off the 1.5 degree that the world is hoping for. And so that's our 4th scenario. We see a very low probability of hitting that net zero 1.5 degree. Now, the question that we're asking at Energy Intelligence is, should the world still be pursuing that 1.5 degree target? We don't see it as realistic based on policies that are in place right now. It's very difficult to get there based on what we're seeing, yet it still stands as a target for all these various countries. So if you go back to the kind of diversification, can we get away from oil? At the moment, we do see policy and technology moving us to a more electrified future. And therefore, especially in transportation, big impacts on transport. If you see it in China, it's happening in many other places too. So you can transition away, but there are a lot of hard to abate sectors that we have not solved yet for. And we don't see that 1.5 degree being in reach. So that's how I would frame it, and maybe we take it from there.
So focusing more a little bit on the MENA region, a region that is known for natural resources, a more dependency on wealth extracted from the ground, especially in the GCC countries. Maybe Dr. Bassam, if you can give us your idea on the possibility, or your view on the possibility of the GCC countries' diversification. How do you see that?
Thank you, Mohammed. First of all, I'm delighted to be here, and it's really great to be joining this panel. And congratulations for organizing this wonderful event. Actually, I would like to make three general observations on the question that you asked. I think the first one is very important to emphasize, that actually the Gulf in particular has not been standing still, and actually its energy and economic system has been transitioning for many years now. Its energy has been evolving, and it will continue to evolve. And actually, if you look at the region, it has been leading in developing some of the clean technologies. And I would say as well, it has been very active in leading climate diplomacy as well, because there was a view in the past that the Gulf been described as obstructionist to climate diplomacy, but actually this is no longer, this has never been the case, and certainly it's not now. And one can mention really few examples from the region. For instance, think about energy pricing reform. And if you look at the Gulf, they've implemented deep energy pricing reform. Gasoline prices are higher, diesel prices are higher, electricity prices are higher now, which actually helped rationalize demand and increase efficiency. And it has also contributed to change in consumer behavior. Also, the region has been investing heavily in renewables. And for the region, actually, it makes perfect sense to invest in clean technologies, particularly renewables, because it can free crude and gas for exports. The region has also been investing in efficiency measures. If you look at the standards they have developed in transport for the cars or for the air conditioning, and if you look at some of the efficiency programs in terms of public lighting and retrofitting building, has been quite impressive. And in the case of the UAE, they have introduced nuclear power into the energy mix, which is freeing gas for exports. So there are plenty of examples as well if you look in terms of the hydrogen ambitious plans that they have. And it's not only about one color of hydrogen, it's both blue and green hydrogen. And in terms of climate diplomacy, as I mentioned, they have been playing an active role and developing new ideas, for instance, like the circular carbon economy, which now is being adopted by the G20 countries. So the first message really is that the region has not been standing still, and it will continue to evolve, and it has the ingredients to diversify into clean technologies. They have the solar and wind resources, the political stability, a clear vision, ability to access capital markets at a very cheap cost, and they have also the national champions as well. So all of these factors are quite important. Having said all of this, and this is my second point, this does not mean that the oil and gas are not going to play a key role in these economies looking forward, because sometimes people tend to confuse the two. Actually, oil and gas will continue to be a very important source of competitive advantage, a very important source of income, which are needed to diversify the economy, but also equally important, they need this income as they start introducing structural reforms. They need to offset the impacts on their consumers and businesses. And there is also another factor as well, which is worth emphasizing, is that despite the fact that those countries have been diversifying away from oil and gas, the fact remains that the rate of return on investments in oil and gas remains quite high. And if the world during the transition starts investing less in oil and gas, actually those returns are going to become even higher. And that takes me to my third and last point, is that if oil and gas is going to remain an important part of the energy mix of the Gulf countries, then the question to me is how to increase the resilience of the oil and gas sector. And in the past, the competition was mainly about developing reserves, capital discipline, cost. But I think there's another area of dimension which is going to become quite important, is lowering the carbon intensity of oil and gas production. And again, the region has a very important advantage. But there is more that needs to be done, and that's why one of the aspects I've been emphasizing, particularly in my research, is how to increase the resilience of oil and gas through technologies, particularly carbon capture and storage. So those are three general points, and I'm happy to develop on any of them.
That's a very perfect summary of the situation in the region. And I would like to move to D.محمد Professor محمدالصبان, on, because you were part of the early conversation on the energy transition, starting from the Kyoto Treaty, being
before that.
So, and being involved in this conversation early on and until today, do you see that there is movement in this transition, aggressive movement? Are we moving fast enough? Should you move slower? Give me your thoughts on the energy transition, maybe more specifically to Saudi Arabia, one of the largest energy producers in the world, or exporters in the world. Now the US is the largest producer.
Thank you, Muhammad, and would like to thank you and your team for organizing this very important conference. For my role, I used to be the head of Saudi delegation for 30 years to the UN climate change negotiations. And given the difficulties of these negotiations, since the oil producers were basically alone in the discussion, even some developing countries were lobbied against us, but we stood very firm in protecting our interests. And for 30 years, there was no real decisions being taken under the umbrella of the United Nations. Having said that, I didn't attend the Paris meeting, but I think we conceded in Paris for one reason or another by not abiding by the Climate Change Convention. The Climate Change Convention talks about the comprehensive approach, that is all greenhouse gases in all sectors. Unfortunately, in Paris Agreement, it was very selective, talking about carbon dioxide and only energy. So this is unfortunate, because this is against the Climate Change Convention principles. The second thing that was being violated is the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. And that is basically being violated, that developed countries are pushing that we need to be equal. They are forgetting that they have polluted the environment with all greenhouse gases for a long period since they started industrialization. And now they are asking the South to do the same as the North. Thirdly, after Paris Agreement, we thought that the industrialized countries will take the lead, but they are not. They are pushing the South to do more, and they are not providing money, nor they are implementing any measures that will reduce emissions. And we have seen there are many examples of the double standard in the West, for example. In the United States, we see the license after license to explore and produce more oil and gas. And also in the UK, just last week, they are issuing license to produce more oil in the North Sea. So this kind of double standard and hypocrisy are not going to be acceptable, because who is going to pay the price is basically the South. They are transferring the burden to the South, saying, well, Aramco should abandon any oil production. Come on. And this has been a statement in the West. Why? What are you doing to allow you to ask Aramco and other oil companies to abandon their production? This is nonsense. This is double standard. We cannot agree with this. And unfortunately, our politicians, they are trying to go with the world, but not in a way to harm ourselves. There is a big risk now. The risk is basically that maybe they are going to force the energy transition, not becoming natural. And then we are going to pay for that. And that is why Saudi Arabia is trying to capture the opportunity to diversify energy sources. We are developing renewables, hydrogen, nuclear, etc., you name it. And we are also, as Dr. Bassam said, we are dealing with the carbon economy, trying to reduce or sequester carbon using sequestration technologies in order to bring our oil very clean. But even with this clean oil, they are objecting, environmentalists being pushed by the politicians. Oh, they cannot do that because this will not allow renewables to revive. So a lot of contradiction in the West that the South is paying the price for it.
So allow me to be the devil's advocate.
I'm sorry?
Okay? Allow me to be the devil's advocate in this panel.
You are always devil's advocate.
So regardless of my position, if I was here in the West, and I would say maybe you should do better. Even if someone is polluting, why, is D.محمد promoting for a slower energy transition? If they're producing oil, we should keep producing oil. What would you say to that person who challenges this argument?
We are not against...
Two wrongs doesn't make it right, huh? Because they're polluting the environment, we should do it.
The approach to get rid of oil is nonsense, because it will never happen. We know that. Actually, by 2040, 80% of the oil demand is going to come from the South. China, India, and the rest of the South and East. So what is moving away from oil? And why is it specifically oil? Until now, there are many Western countries who are giving subsidies to coal. And when I talked during negotiation with Mr. Tritton, the Minister Tritton, yes, why you are subsidizing coal? He said, well, we have hundreds of thousands of German employees in the coal industry. I said, the whole population of Saudi Arabia is behind the oil industry. I said, well, I cannot argue with you. And he left me.
So maybe let me take another side of this conversation and actually talk to Mr. Hussein Al-Mir. So you're leading a very interesting story, right? So we had the talk today by His Excellency, the Minister of Oil of Bahrain, and he mentioned how he's managing a very difficult portfolio. So he's doing oil and he's doing climate affairs, right? But you're leading more on the renewables side. So a complementary, and the UAE is an oil producer. Can you tell me more about the story of the UAE, the story of Masdar? What are you guys doing in that direction? And maybe it's a complementary story to what D.محمد is saying. We're actually, there's efforts in diversifying away from oil.
Sure. First of all, I would like really to thank you for your invitation. It's always a great pleasure to be with all of you here and participate with such fantastic panelists. So let me start first to give you a bit of introduction about Masdar. As one of the fastest renewable energy company globally, Masdar has been pioneer in advancing clean energy sector globally, and also positioning the UAE as a global hub in energy technology and also sustainability and advancing kind of country in achieving net zero target globally. So currently we have a portfolio of around 20 gigawatt globally, present in 40 plus countries, and also deployed more than $30 billion globally. When it comes to our investment, MENA region has been one of the key kind of pillars and an area where we keep really investing. We started our journey, as I mentioned, in 2008 and trying to unlock the markets. If you look at our investment, for example, we invested heavily in the UAE. We have partnered and developed 2 major projects, including the 2 gigawatt Al-Dhafra project, which is considered the largest single solar site globally. On top of that, we are currently developing 2 major projects and part of the 5 gigawatt Mohammed bin Rashid solar park, which is expected to supersede Al-Dhafra once it's completed. On top of that, we have also actively participating in decarbonizing the renewable energy or energy sector in Saudi Arabia. We have developed, we are currently having around 2 gigawatt portfolio in Saudi Arabia, including Dawmat al-Jandal, which is considered the largest onshore wind in the MENA region. Another example that we can see also in the MENA region, for example, Jordan. We have invested in Jordan since 2015, developing both onshore wind and solar. So what we can see actually, diversification, it's becoming really important because also it helped from a resilience perspective of the economy of those kind of countries, specifically in the MENA region. So we believe in complementarity approach. So you still need an oil and gas because also your population is growing, your energy demand also is growing. But on top of that, you need also maybe a new source of energy that could also stimulate your economic activity because also it creates jobs. It helps really to diversify your country and also generate a new stream of revenue.
Amazing. And I would like to pick some points from the 2 gentlemen and go back to Alex. So we're collaborating on the roundtables here in LPS. Energy Intelligence is conducting roundtables around the world when it comes to the energy transition. You bring policymakers, investors, and basically everyone that have a stake in the energy transition, and you tour the world to come up to a conclusion about this conversation. And maybe picking up on what Professor Mohammed said and Hussein, what was the conclusion? Are we going to move away from oil fast? How did you feel the response from South, the global North, who were part of the table? And by the way, we hosted them here on campus, ministers and people who were very active in this conversation.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I think what Dr. Saban says is very important because you cannot talk about this debate without talking about the ideological kind of almost messianic view on all sides of this. And so as an organizer of content, our job is to bring people together like we're trying to do today. And bringing together the 2 sides to talk about this issue on a rational basis is very, very, very difficult. And we've tried it. It doesn't work. Certain, on both sides, they don't want to talk, and they haven't wanted to talk. So what we've concluded is if it's ideological that either we're going to get rid of oil tomorrow or whenever, or we're never, ever, and we're always going to use oil and renewables that never work, you sort of set those 2 aside and say, okay, fine, we don't know what the future holds. But there are people in the middle that want to have this discussion. So what we are trying to do is bring together all those people that do want to talk, that are interested and open to having a discussion with everybody, from government, from company to civil society, sit them down and have a discussion around. This year, we're working on hydrogen. Hydrogen is, maybe we picked the timing a bit wrong, as I was talking with Bassem, because hydrogen sort of had a kind of boom and bust cycle, and it's, we can talk more about that. Last year, we were focusing on critical minerals and the impact of critical minerals on the new energy, on the future energy economy, and what really is driving that. So what we've found is that people do want to talk if you get them in the room together, and you can get a very productive discussion if you get the right people together. But if you get the activists, you're not going to get a very productive conclusion there. So, I mean, I'm optimistic that there are people that want to talk. There are serious people that want to find a solution here. And you can bring them together to actually find what the answer is. Now, what we're talking about is politics, and the politics is toxic, super toxic. And how toxic it is, it's amazing in COP28 last year that we actually reached some sort of agreement. And I think His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz, the Minister of Energy from Saudi Arabia, sort of described the conclusion of that event as, look, there's multiple pathways where you can reach a new energy future. And it isn't only the West or the North sort of agenda that has to get you there. Every nation can pick its path that it wants to go down. And that's a remarkable concession, because those texts that were coming out earlier in the week didn't have anything in that. They weren't even close to that, right? And by the end of the week, you had, actually, I mean, we were amazed at the compromise that the nations to actually get us there. No, it's not perfect. I don't think anyone thinks it's perfect. But if the world is going to come together to find a solution, you need to have both sides compromise. And they're still going to have the ideological kind of component to it. But on the political basis, they were able to find a compromise. And I think in Azerbaijan next year, you have a way forward, where if that didn't happen last year in the UAE, you were not going to be able to do that. So again, I remain optimistic. Even on the political level, you can get there. I think the most important thing to think about when you think about the transition, and can we move away from oil or gas or anything else, or can we deal with the emissions problem, is technology. Technology is going to drive this. And when we look at this, the technological advancement, that's what's going to make the difference. The policy will matter, obviously, and the policy matters big time, especially in the elections that are coming up this year, US, UK, EU, India. That's going to matter a lot. But the technology is going to be developing separate from that. And how quickly that moves on solar costs, battery costs, EV costs, hydrogen costs, CCS costs, all that stuff, of course, is policy-driven, but it's going to be technology-driven as well.
So that's impressive. And the complexity of this conversation, it really embeds a lot of different changes. So social implications, you know, with all the voting coming in, and people impact on the people when it comes to the cost of energy. Now, leaving this behind us, and let's say, if we move to the new energy sources, what are the challenges in that? So we had the logistics, the head of the Saudi program, NIDLIP, so National Industrial Development and Logistics Program, one of Vision 2030 programs, and logistics in the new energy transition is a challenge. So it was mentioned that I think by Daniel Yergin in his book, we're going to the era of shuffles. Right, so critical minerals for the energy transition is going to be critical. And the policies around, so we're having problems with oil, but then if we switch from oil, there's a new set of problems waiting us as well. It's not a green future, you know, it's not a very easy future as well. So maybe, Dr. Bassam, if you can give us some of the views on the energy transition, what are challenges waiting us, logistical, critical minerals, and also if there's any environmental impact with the critical minerals as well.
Okay, just very quickly, because I think my colleagues here emphasized a couple of points. Of course, when we talk about the energy transition, we're not talking about one path. And, you know, the path that every country takes will depend very much on your resource endowments. It will depend very much your starting positions. So, for instance, in the case of the EU, they don't have oil and gas reserves. So for them, it actually makes sense to move away from oil and gas. But, you know, from the Gulf, you cannot expect them to move away from oil and gas exactly in the same way as the EU, exactly like what India means to them coal. That's why they emphasize the concept of unabated coal. I think the US position is quite interesting because the US is rich in hydrocarbons and in renewables. So it's quite interesting to see how they're going to transition themselves. At the end of the day, the world tends to forget that sometimes that the US is the biggest oil and gas producer in the world. In any case, leaving that aside. Now, there is this concept that the oil and gas sectors are not resilient, and if we move to this new world, it's going to prove much more resilient. And I have to say, I find that argument very difficult to grapple with, because if you look at what happened in the oil market, we have seen some of the biggest shocks. You're talking about the COVID shock. You're talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. Huge government intervention in terms of sanctions, price caps. And still the market performed extremely well. We've seen actually the biggest reshuffle of crude oil exports from Europe, from Russia to Europe, to the rest, to Asia. And despite of all of these shocks, okay, the trade routes are longer, but look at the oil price, 75 to 85 range, despite all of these shocks. Look at what happened in case of gas. You lose one of the biggest suppliers in the world, and now gas prices are very similar to what they were pre-crisis. So how can oil and gas not be resilient? I really cannot think of any other fuel at the moment having such a scale and not being, and not being resilient. So that argument needs to be taken a little bit more critically, because as you move into new technologies, the issues of affordability, reliability are going to be as important. The issues of geopolitical risk are going to remain. The way you deal with them are different because they pose different types, but it doesn't mean that we're going to move to a world that all of the problems are going to go away and the things that we don't worry about, for instance, affordability, reliability, all of these issues are going to go away. I think that that type of debate is a naive, and actually it doesn't help even in the type of the discussions when it relates to the energy transition.
Amazing. So building D.محمدالصبان on the notes from Alex, from Dr. Bassam. So Alex mentioned that we need to find a common ground to have this conversation. If we're set in our ways, we will never agree. And Dr. Bassam mentioned that there's always multiple paths.
Unjust as well, because you need to bring the concept of justice, energy transition. What worries me is that if the world is going to go each on its own, we might end up in a situation where we create what we call the climate clubs. So you have a group of people who are rich, they have achieved their industrialization, and they start imposing penalties on those countries that are not moving fast enough. So if you want the COP process to continue, it has to be inclusive, it has to be just, so you bring everyone with you.
Yeah. Fair. And also building on this very important point of being just, how would you compromise? So let's say you represent the MENA region, the oil producers. How can you compromise for everyone to have this conversation? Suggest multiple ways that we can get to the table together.
We already compromised a lot. But I fully agree with Dr. Bassam that the oil and gas industry are very resilient. And there are many examples of that. Given the huge taxes on oil products for many decades, and we didn't reach the peak as they were thinking of. The West started with energy security, that this is the main issue in the 70s. And we need to stop importing oil from Middle East. And then it proves that we are secure. And now, so they changed that, and they took the climate change issue as a pretext for any future action. Even though there are many disagreement on the cause of climate change, we are not going to get in that. But this is basically as if it was coming from the sky, that we need to push through the climate change issue these things.
But don't you feel that this is a bit divisive? Like when you divide East and West, North and South, and I'm being the devil advocate, in this panel, would this, because there had been initiatives from all around the world and really a push to electrify, to implement renewables and electricity in multiple countries in Europe and also in North America. Do you feel that the narrative to address this conversation needs to be a little more centered instead of us and you and
Sorry, Mohammed, can
my friend, let me comment on yours. The issue of South and North is a basic issue. It has been with us for many decades. And since the 70s, we are pushing for the equality and trying to provide assistance to the South, and never happened. And now even under the Climate Change Convention, where there are specific commitments on developed countries to assist and help And they never did that. On the ground that, well, we need all of us. They want the South to finance the South. So this is also nonsense. I'm not trying to distinguish, but this is unfortunately the case in the international arena. And those who were living these issues know that exactly. So with these discriminations, you cannot afford to address it in the right way, because you are engaged in that those are basically attacking your oil, you like it or not. And this should stop. We need to be realistic. I don't agree with my friend that, well, the oil peak will come into by 2030. This is not true. This is wishful thinking. Because there is a growing demand in the South tremendously. And we should not forget that. Of course, Western countries arrived at the peak a long time ago. So we are not counting on the West to revive the oil demand. The South is the most important driver for the oil demand, whether we like it or not. So let us not mix the wishful thinking with reality. I hope my friend can agree with me on this.
Well, let me answer that. So again, like I said,
we're having a heated discussion, so I'm delivering my promise.
Good. No, so in response to Dr. Salman, we don't mind whether we never transition or we transition tomorrow. We just say what we see. So the scenario that we see right now, driven by technology and policy, looks to be possible you could peak in the early 2030s. But we have another scenario, which is also possible and quite probable, where oil does not peak until we get to 2040. It really depends on how those policies and technologies develop. And there's a rate, nobody can tell the future, and I think we know that very well.
But you put it firmly that it is by 2030 there will be a peak in the demand. Nonsense. Sorry to say that.
But if you look at the curve, so I guess, so if we dig in, because we dig into this deeply, because we look at the IEA forecast, we look at OPEC forecasts, we look at all the forecasts, which are quite different. The big differentiator is the question of the South. What happens to oil demand in India? What happens to oil demand in China? China is a little bit less controversial. What happens to oil demand in Africa? And what happens in Latin America? How do those, and the Middle East as well, of course. So the question is, do those economies develop as the West developed into highly energy intensive economies that are based highly on fossil fuels? Or do they move to other sources of energy? Do they become electrified sooner? Do they use more renewables, as my friend over there is talking about from Masdar? And so those are the judgments that you're making. And nobody really can know how that develops. But there's going to be a mix of how India develops. So does India consumes around what, 5.5 million barrels a day right now of oil? So does India go to where China is today, which is 16 million or so? Or does it peak at 7.5 or 8? Those are the big differences in the kind of estimations of how these economies develop. And nobody quite knows, but you're going to have to make a call on technology, policy, et cetera, based on how those economies develop. So again, we're very open to any number of these scenarios, but there are forces that are driving these economies to transition away from oil and gas and coal, and there are forces that are causing them to stay. And you'll have to take a judgment on which of those are going to drive which way.
You know that, just commenting on this, sorry. You know that fossil fuel was, the share of fossil fuel was 82% in the
1970s.
Yes.
And today as well.
And now it is 80%. So you didn't achieve that much in spite of your effort to do that.
Yeah.
I don't know why you hate oil. You need to be realistic.
So Alex doesn't hate oil. Alex is in the center. He doesn't. No. But for the sake of time, I want to get your points, Dr. Bassam.
Very quickly.
Yes,
because first of all, I don't want to enter into this.
Thank you.
When oil demand is going to peak and things like that, I'm not going to enter into that debate. But what I would like to emphasize is that certainly the world is changing, and one thing that the Gulf countries can do is they can increase the resilience of their oil and gas sector. And I think they can do that in multiple ways, because the competition is not going to be only in terms of cost and capital discipline and replenishing of reserves, but it's also going to be on the carbon footprint of your oil and gas activities. And the Gulf region has the competitive advantage to compete on that front. So that actually would increase the resilience. So in an uncertain world, they have a much better position. So that's one observation. The second observation, directly related to your question, I think if you look at COP28 and paragraph 28, I think, actually the answer to your question is there. National circumstances, differentiated responsibility, and then you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, every option. So if you want to go solar and renewables, be my guest. If you want to transition away from fossil fuels, be my guest. If you want to use unabated coal, be my guest. If you want to use CCS, hydrogen, everything is on the table. And I think that is what's so special about COP28, is that it put all of the options on the table, which was not before. The question is, what next? Now that all of the options are on the table and everything is accepted, what is next? I think that is going to be basically a challenge.
I agree with you. Just one point on Dr. Bassam. I agree with you if we are doing it the right way. But if we deviate from the convention and try to do it our own way, then this is as if you are transferring the burden to developing countries. And that's not acceptable. Actually, as Saudi Arabia announced, that we will export all kinds of energy sources. So you are going to be dependent on the Gulf, not only for oil, but also for gas, for renewables, for hydrogen, etc. So we are playing the same game as you are doing, my friend.
So I want to give a seat on the table for the renewables as well to be part of this conversation. So Hussein, listening to this argument from the energy transition, how fast are we transitioning? But you're actually transitioning in Masdar, right? You're actually doing the work. So maybe you're more equipped to give us a real glimpse on action, because you're leading the action of transitioning into renewables, wind energy. So give us your views on that.
Let's start actually, as I mentioned, where we started initially in the MENA region. Yeah. So first of all, there was no kind of clear policy in terms of advocating or supporting a renewable energy kind of sector. And what we have seen actually over the years, there have been a lot of evolution in terms of the policy, in terms of the market design, and also permitting and consenting a lot of projects really to take off and to reach, let's say, COD and participate in the energy sector. I think this is also a big achievement when it comes to the sector or to the MENA region and also to the energy sector. We truly believe that complementarity is very important. We still need oil and gas, but we still need also renewable energy, because there is truly a commercial business case for renewable energy to play a role in the MENA region. So, for example, taking the example of Dr. Fatouh, what he said about oil and gas, for example, we announced in the UAE that we are going to decarbonize our oil and gas industry by connecting all the oil and gas with our renewable energy kind of technology, including the clean technology and what I meant here, the nuclear power. Also, we see the same kind of initiatives being pursued elsewhere around the world, including, for example, in the UK when they announced NTOG, which is also decarbonization of oil and gas. So this is one kind of an important topic that's being taken by, let's say, the MENA region, and most importantly by the GCC, to decarbonize the oil and gas, which is very important. But on top of that, what we have seen also, that freeing up gas and also oil is becoming very important by using solar and wind, and because it could provide stable and most competitive kind of cost of energy. What is really important going forward, and this is not really just in the GCC and MENA region, but also more globally, is to ensure that we have the right framework to build, let's say, a system of energy of tomorrow, because it has to have all kinds of sources of energy. But what's also really important is to ensure that we have the right investment into the infrastructure. What I meant here is around the port infrastructure, supply chain, which is a big biggest kind of bottleneck really for renewable energy, because I think this has been tested and proven to be really tough during COVID and even after COVID. As you rightly said, for example, the critical mineral becoming very important, supply chain, logistics, and also manufacturing facility.
Perfect. I think we've heard it all. You've heard both sides of the conversation, and you've known about the projects active in the region. I would like you all to join me in thanking our panelists. This was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.